start the symphony.
Those should be the last notes of the symphony. Those are the first shots of the revolution. Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. The first 2 of his symphonies were somewhat mildly controversial. But when he wrote that symphony with those 2 notes, he announced that everything would be different from here on. If you are one of those people who's sitting at home, I want you might consider going onto YouTube and typing Beethoven Genius 3rd Symphony. The BBC produced a feature-length movie of the day when Beethoven premiered this symphony for a private audience in the house of a wealthy patron of music in Vienna for the first time. And at that performance, old man Haydn, who was still alive and had about another 1.5 years to live, was in attendance, and he heard the music. And at the end of it, he is reported to have said, "After this, everything is different." And he was right. Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. He never wrote another one bigger than this until the 9th. So between 3 and 9, there's 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. They're all smaller. This is the big one. This is the big one. And he does lots of things to try to keep you off balance. So the first movement is in 3/4 time. And I want you to notice what happens. As soon as Beethoven gets you nice and comfortable with 3/4 time, then he's going to start monkeying with the beat and letting you think, are we in 3/4 time or are we in 2/4 time? I'll give you an example. You will hear some of the most dissonant writing that had ever been achieved. Beethoven was losing his hearing, but he wasn't deaf. He knew what he was doing. Now, I deliberately put in the program the timings for all of the movements. And if you had been paying attention, of course, I talked a lot in the first half, and we played the Star Spangled Banner and the Pledge of Allegiance. If you took all 3 of the pieces we played on the first half of the program and totaled them up, they do not achieve the length of this first movement. That's how big it is. Mozart could write an entire symphony, and he could perform an entire symphony in 18 minutes. So what is Beethoven doing? I want you to stop and think for just a minute of this hall that we are in. We don't have to build buildings this grandiose and this marvelous, but why not? And if we do you realize how many doors there are in this building and how many hidden places there are in this building? And Beethoven goes to every door, and he opens every door, and he sees what's in it. That's how you end up with an 18-minute first movement, because Beethoven is writing the musical equivalent of this building. He's just going to take you every place that he can think of. It's pure genius from beginning to end, but that's what you need to know. Now, Beethoven was a revolutionary. He was not the sort of Bernie Sanders revolutionary. He was a revolutionary in the mode of Thomas Jefferson. He didn't see any reason why the powdered wig types and the dukes and earls and princes needed to stay in charge of things. So when he was beginning this symphony, he saw the rise of Napoleon and realized that Napoleon was going to depose all of those royal people in Europe. And so as Beethoven was writing this piece, the subtitle was Buonaparte. This was his symphony to be dedicated to the great revolutionary of his era. And then Beethoven heard that the great revolutionary had crowned himself emperor in Paris. Now when Beethoven heard that, in a fit of fury, he took the top page of the manuscript score, tore it into pieces, and renamed the symphony the Heroic Symphony, the Eroica Symphony, and dedicated it, this was not part of the official dedication, to the memory of a great man. And then later on, you know, everybody wants good press. So look at the second movement. Now the title is in your program is in Italian, Marcia Funebre. The second movement is a funeral march. And Beethoven said, see, I knew. So I wrote a funeral march for Mr. Napoleon, knowing that he would eventually do terrible things. So here's the beginning of the second movement, the funeral march. So that's what the funeral march for Mr. Napoleon sounds like. Now, this piece was composed in 1804, 5, 06, in that era. So remember, Haydn was still alive. Mozart hadn't been dead all that long. Mozart's last symphonies and all of Haydn's last symphonies have as their third movement a minuet. And the minuet is something that lasted into the symphony well past its expiration date. This is truly music of the white powdered wig types. And if the third movement were a minuet, it might sound like this. Beethoven wasn't going to have any of that. So he sped it up a little bit. No, that's not fast enough. Bunch is faster and real soft. So that's what happens to the minuet. Beethoven turns it in, and if you look at the third movement titled, the word scherzo means joke. So Beethoven is playing a trick, but he does it deliberately, and then the tempo marking is allegro vivace. Now, until Beethoven's time, in symphonies, the first movement was the heavy movement. That's where the composer did his most studious writing, and the last movement was a toss-off, a movement that didn't matter to anything. And Beethoven maybe seems like he's going to do this, but not quite. First of all, at the end of the scherzo, just to make sure everybody's shut up and ready to go, we have this ginormous fanfare to start the last movement. That, my friends, is a scaffold. It's the ribs that hold this building up. So that's what Beethoven does, is he starts off with that tune which in its simplicity sounds just silly. And then, upon that, he builds variations. And the variations get more complicated and more intense and crazier and crazier. And at the end, Beethoven says, you know, I need you to think really deeply and really profoundly. And so towards the end of the fourth movement, he slows everything down and we have a slow movement again. Again, based on that same melody. And then, when we're done with that, the little fanfare that started the fourth movement comes back and we have a fantastic finish. So, if you will set your clocks right now, figure out how long it's going to take. All the timings, we've timed it in rehearsal Tuesday night. So from now until we're done with the symphony, we've got to keep our concentration up, and we've got to find a way to keep you guys enthralled as we play one of the great masterpieces of Western art music, Mr. Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Heroic Symphony.